My name is Chris Harwood. I'm the president of the New York chapter of the Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences, and I'm really happy to welcome you to our first program of this academic year. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'm going to invite you to our next event coming up Monday, October 23rd. We're going to have a dramatic reading of two scenes from Václav Havel's classic 1965 play, The Memorandum, Vyrozumění in Czech. And this is going to be kind of a translation study. The translators will be two of my students at Columbia University, one drama student, and none other than Paul Wilson, who is probably the premier literary translator of Czech literature into English for the past several decades. Paul will be joining us on Zoom for a discussion after the stage reading to talk about translation. And so I am very happy to introduce and to welcome our speaker today, Ladislav Jackson. He is a historian of visual arts and architecture. Since 2018, he's been assistant professor at the Department of Art History and Theory of Art in the Faculty of Fine Arts at the Brno Technical University, VUT Brno. And there he teaches courses in global and local 20th century art and critical theory, including feminist, queer, and critical race studies. His research focuses on 20th century architecture and design and on gender and queer studies in art history. Back in 2016, he was a Fulbright scholar at the University of California at Berkeley. Jackson also curates exhibitions on architecture and design, and he's written, edited, or co-edited about 20 books, including Hotel Praha from 2019, Villas and Family Houses in Hradec Králové from 2020, Myth of an Architect, Jan Kotěra, 150, from 2021, The Church of the Divine Heart, 1928 to 1932, published in 2022, and his latest, of particular relevance for tonight's presentation, Philosopher of Structures, Architect and Engineer Jaroslav Josef Polívka, 1886 to 1960. Ladislav Jackson is Executive Director of the Society for Queer Memory in Prague. Please join me in welcoming Ladislav Jackson.
Hello, everyone. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for being here with me. And I would like to mention that today is actually a national holiday in the Czech Republic of St. Wenceslas. So let me start with the fact that Jaroslav Josef Polívka was also a great Czech patriot after he immigrated to the United States in 1939. Which I barely speak about, but I think today is the best occasion to mention also that. And he didn't bring many books because of the circumstances of his immigration in 1939, but he brought two books. Of course, he acquired more books later in his later career here in the United States, but he brought two books, as far as we know. The first one was Thomas Garrick Masaryk's collected writings in English, and the second one was Pravidla českého pravopisu, which is regulation or the thesaurus of Czech language. Also, Jaroslav Josef Polívka, this is him, in 1957 on a porch or a terrace in his own house in Berkeley, on Art Street, and there was a beautiful terrace where he liked to sit next to his office, and you can see that over there in the corner you can see a picture of the Old Town Square, which is another way how he showed his patriotism. And he also loved to eat Czech food, which was not very simple. It was not very easy to get some Czech meals in San Francisco in 1950s and 1940s, but he managed to do so, and he found a Czech restaurant, Mankas, which was also a hotel in Inverness, in northern part of the San Francisco Bay Area, where he loved to go and take his family to eat svíčková and řízek, schnitzels, and so on and so forth. So that's what we know so far about Jaroslav Josef Polívka's patriotism, and these couple of slides I wanted to show you to celebrate the national holiday. Let me first start with how I came across Jaroslav Josef Polívka. It's actually a funny story. So when I first came to the United States in 2016 for my Fulbright scholarship, the first month it was in December, so the first month I stayed at a friend's in San Francisco at the Hayes and Ashbury Street, and you probably know that it's a very historical district. It's the only district in San Francisco that wasn't damaged by the fire in 1906, so there are a lot of Victorian and historical houses, and because they are protected as historical houses, you can't actually tamper with them, you can't add any infrastructure into the houses, and therefore there is no heating. And I didn't realize that, I didn't know that, and then I didn't realize that, and that's why I spent most of my days in San Francisco Public Library, which is the building next to it, and I took all the classes that I could. I went to knitting class, I went to patchwork class, I went to pottery class, I went to, of course, public reading of several books, and at that time there was also a public presentation and lecture of a new book, which was just published at that time by Professor Paul Venable Turner, who is emeritus professor at Stanford University of Architecture, Art and Architecture History, and he just published a book, Frank Lloyd Wright and San Francisco. And during his talk, he severally mentioned the familiar sounding name Polivka. I had no idea who that was. Of course, there is Oswald Polivka, who is much more distinguished architect around 1900 back in the Czech Republic. But I have never heard of Jaroslav Polívka before, and there was no Wikipedia entry at that time of Jaroslav Josef Polívka, so it was kind of difficult to find out who he was. Then I found out that at Bancroft Library there is actually some archive of Jaroslav Josef Polívka, and then I contacted his grandchildren. First, I came across Katka Hammond, who is his oldest granddaughter, and then I also met 3 of his other grandchildren who actually live in San Francisco Bay Area, and I found out that his grandson, Ron Polivka, and his wife, Victoria, they have 14 archival boxes in their attic of Jaroslav Polívka's stuff, those are the boxes. This is how Jaroslav Polívka organized them. Those are the original black binders with different titles, different projects, different topics. Apparently he was very organized, and they contain something about 12,000 of archival documents, and over the next couple of years I went through them with Ron, and with his help we digitized them. 2 years ago in 2021, because mostly his wife Victoria wanted to get rid of the old stuff in the attic and clean out the house, so they decided to donate the archival documents into 4 different archives. One part is in Prague, one part is in Madrid, that's related to Eduardo Torroja, which I will speak about later. One part is at the Bancroft Library in Berkeley, and one part went to University at Buffalo because there was already a significant archive of Jaroslav Polívka. And based on this research, I discovered this amazing life story of an engineer and of an architect, inventor, and a Renaissance human being. And I would like to share this life story with you today. So in 2021, I put together this exhibition about Jaroslav Polívka, which was first in Brno, and it was more concerned with his Brno projects. Then a year later, or 6 months later, we did another version of the exhibition in Prague, and it was more concerned with his Prague projects. But what was I think the most significant part of this exhibition was this mind map, if you will, or the detective crazy wall, with networks that actually surrounded Jaroslav Polívka and also a little bit Frank Lloyd Wright. You can find him here. Here's Frank Lloyd Wright, here's Jaroslav Polívka. These are all the contacts that he had, professional contacts, that he had back in Czechoslovakia, and these are the contacts he developed when he came to the United States. And this year, and that's the reason why I'm here, at this time or at this point. This year we are about to publish, or I'm about to publish, the Faculty of Fine Arts is about to publish a book about Jaroslav Polívka, Philosopher of Structures, architect and engineer Jaroslav J. Polívka, and the story that I'm about to share with you is going to be in this book. Hopefully it will be out in February. So what I'm going to talk about today, because we are in New York and I came all the way from Brno to New York to tell you New Yorkers about New York, how bold is that? So I'm going to focus on 3 projects that Jaroslav Josef Polívka did for New York. And hopefully I will try also to illustrate how important he was in Frank Lloyd Wright circles. But first, let me briefly go through Jaroslav Josef Polívka's career before he immigrated to the United States. Jaroslav Josef Polívka was born in 1886 in this house. Of course, it looked different back then in the 19th century. It was remodeled in 1920s, but it's still there. And his father owned a wine shop, probably in the cellar or probably in the ground floor. We are not sure. But unfortunately, his father died when Jaroslav Josef Polívka was about 5 or 6 years old. And then he was raised by his mother and also his uncle. And he, even though his background was not so privileged, he was able to finish his university studies at the German Technical University. Jaroslav Josef Polívka died in 1960 in Berkeley, only a couple of months after Frank Lloyd Wright passed away. So that's also one of the reasons why some of the projects from the later stage of their cooperation stayed unbuilt. So here we have him. This is probably the first known photo of Jaroslav Josef Polívka when he was just 18 years old, when he signed up for the German Technical University. Jaroslav Josef Polívka, during his grammar school and during his high school, he did a very good thing because he learned languages, and apparently he spoke 6 languages throughout his life, and therefore he could enroll to German Technical University. It was no problem for him. This is his grading book. He wasn't such a good student, but afterwards, after he graduated, he became very distinguished. After he graduated in 1910, he got employed by several several building companies, and one of them was a company of Karel Herzan, who was a very significant builder at the time, and he was specialized in ferroconcrete constructions, and they did this beautiful Art Nouveau style bridge in Postoloprty in northern Bohemia. And at the time, Jaroslav Josef Polívka was asked to supervise the construction, and because he spent a couple of weeks or probably a couple of months during the summer months, he met his future wife, Maria Irma, Polák, later Polívka, and 2 years later they married. There were some hiccups on the way, but that's another story. In 1913, Jaroslav Josef Polívka decided not to be employed by Czech building companies anymore, and he decided to move to Switzerland. In Switzerland, he got employed by a couple of very significant building companies. One of them was a company that was led by Giorgio Neumann, who was probably the longest friend and colleague of Jaroslav Josef Polívka. They exchanged correspondence until 1960, until Jaroslav Josef Polívka passed away. And he did a large number of very various buildings, mostly bridges, but also tunnels and other engineering buildings, but also some storage rooms and also some accommodation for workers. In 1916, Jaroslav Josef Polívka had to go to war, or he tried to escape the war because he was a pacifist. So he didn't really want to go to war. Who does? This is the family in Zurich. You can see that they were doing very well. They rented a villa at the bank of the Zurich lake, so it was very beautiful. Unfortunately, he tried to flee to Vienna to escape the military, but unfortunately he had to go to war for about a year. He got wounded at the Italian front. It was considered a punishment because he went to the first front, and then he came back. This is him on vacation when he saw his youngest son for the very first time. After the war ended in October 1918, he decided to reside back to Prague, and because he became quite wealthy during his stay in Zurich, in Switzerland, he decided to start a business where he will be sort of a developer. He will buy cheap sites and he will construct houses, or he will sell the sites later, and so on and so forth. So in Bubenec, which was a developing bourgeois district at the time, he built a couple of these beautiful family houses. You can see that they are in all kind of different styles, from modernism to quite conservative style, or what we call Jewish modernism, because that was a building that was owned by two Jewish lawyers. In 1927, Jaroslav Josef Polívka made a very good decision, because he decided to employ a very progressive avant-garde architect, Josef Havlíček, who just graduated from the university studies. And together they did a lot of visionary projects. This one was unbuilt. This was a competition project for the bridge over the Nusle Valley, where you can see that the bridge is supported by 9 towers like this, and you could access the towers from the top, from the bridge, or from the bottom, from the valley. So Josef Havlíček came up with these new progressive avant-garde ideas, and also helped Jaroslav Josef Polívka to design some of these city palaces, administrative and retail palaces in Prague. One of the most famous one is Palace Chicago, which is this one. Jaroslav Josef Polívka also expanded at the end of the 1920s to Brno, and in 1920s, between 1928 to 1929, he built 3 palaces in the city center of Brno. They are still there. One of them was beautifully renovated, so that's why I put there the contemporary picture. It's the Palace Jalta, and there is also this retail passage, as you can see here. In 1928, there was a huge exhibition of contemporary culture, which was supposed to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Czechoslovak state. It was in Brno. The fair complex was funded especially for this exhibition. It's still there. And Jaroslav Josef Polívka saw it as an opportunity to present himself. So that's why, on his expenses, he built these 4. There was a 5th one, but I don't have a picture of that one. 5 pavilions for this exhibition. One of them was this exhibition apartment building, and he employed multiple avant-garde artists and interior designers like Karel Honzík, Hanna Kučerová-Záveska, and other young architects and designers to equip the exhibition apartments. Jaroslav Josef Polívka also specialized in hotels. These are modern hotels, one in Luhačovice, one in Slovakia, Nový Smokovec, in the Tatry, beautiful, beautiful natural settings. And so those were the last projects of Jaroslav Josef Polívka before he had to shut down his office and his business because of the Grand Depression. So in 1931, 1932, Jaroslav Josef Polívka was forced to sell his beautiful villa in Bubenec, which you can see here, also sell most of his artistic collections. You can see that their living room looked like a museum. And they had to move to various different apartments. This is the last one that they inhabited in Veletržní 9th Street. Jaroslav Josef Polívka also dismantled his business, and he got himself employed by the Thermolux company. Thermolux company was an Italian company that experimented with various different glass bricks and glass materials in building constructions. But Jaroslav Josef Polívka didn't see it as something bad. He saw it as an opportunity to explore new material. And not only that, he was a very good sales manager for the Thermolux company, but he also started doing research in glass and glass concrete constructions. These are promotion brochures or promotion booklets that Jaroslav Josef Polívka did for the Thermolux company. In 1935, Jaroslav Josef Polívka got back on his feet, and he renewed his business, and he started working especially for the Czechoslovak state, for the Ministry of Public Affairs. And that's where we get to the New York City. In 1935, it was first decided that Czechoslovakia will attend the World Fair in Paris in 1937, and a year later, because it took mostly 2 years to prepare the pavilions and all the stuff that will be exhibited there. In 1936, it was decided that Czechoslovakia will attend the World Fair in New York in 1939 to 1940. So we will talk about these three locations, but I will first start with the Czech-Slovak pavilion in the Flushing Meadows Park, which is where the World Fair in 1939 to 1940 took place. But we will conclude with the third location, which is the Belmont Park in Eastern Queens, where the Belmont Racetrack Pavilion by Frank Lloyd Wright was supposed to be built, but it was not built. Spoiler alert. So we will start with the Czech-Slovak Pavilion in New York, in Queens. This is the site now where the Czechoslovak Pavilion used to be. In 1963, I think there was another fair, and they built another pavilion there. It was a pavilion of some kind of American beer. But as you can see, no pavilions are no longer there. So they started to organize the Ministry of Public Affairs, which was the main organizer of these pavilions and the attendance of the World Fairs, started to organize the Czechoslovak Pavilion in 1936. At the same time, they were preparing for the Czechoslovak Pavilion or the Czechoslovak attendance at the World Fair in Paris in 1937. As you can see, this pavilion was built of steel and glass. It won a grand medal for this construction because it was quite very unusual. You can see, I think it's a Danish pavilion next to it, and you can see, Swedish pavilion next to it, which you can see is not that modern as the Czechoslovak pavilion. But the main reason why they decided to build the Czechoslovak pavilion this way was because Czechoslovakia wanted to export glass and steel, of course. So the main reason for taking part in these world fairs was, of course, to present the national culture, the cultural new culture, and also scientific achievements, but also to ensure that the country will also export a lot of their goods. So Czechoslovakia wanted to present themselves as an exporter of steel and glass. However, that was not the case for the pavilion in the United States, because Czechoslovakia didn't really export steel or glass to the United States. They wanted to export steel and glass to other European countries, which makes sense to exhibit it in Paris, but it makes zero sense to exhibit it in New York City. So, for example, this is the export and how it developed over the past 3 years from Czechoslovakia to the United States. And you can see that it was mostly light industry, textile, and shoes. And the main reason why they decided not to build or not to present such a provocative or progressive construction made of glass and steel was because they wanted to emphasize the other goods that Czechoslovakia had to offer to the American market. So the main organizer at the Ministry of Public Affairs was Jan Sucharda, who was an officer at the ministry. However, he was very inventive when it came to how the pavilion is supposed to look like and what it should represent. So they decided that there was a huge discussion among Czech architects and of course among companies that were producing constructing material what the pavilion is supposed to be made of. There was a huge lobby that it should be made of wood because of course Czechoslovakia didn't want to export wood to the United States, but because there was no point in bringing steel from all the way from Czechoslovakia to the United States. But the steel lobby won, and they decided to make it out of steel, even though they didn't want to export any steel to the United States. Jan Sucharda created the program for the competition for architects of the pavilion in 1938, and he really had some very original ideas. He said that unlike the exhibition in Paris a year before, it should be staged as a theater because, on one hand, the spectator looks, the spectator does not think. And on the other hand, the presentation had to be appropriate for the American audience, whose, quote, mentality was branded by Kaiserling as that of a 15-year-old girl, end quote. And on top of that, he appealed to architects and designers to keep in mind that, quote, romantic and naive, but at the same time, to absolutely concrete things and concepts will cling to the American psyche of the visitors, end quote. So this is the program and this is the sketch of Jan Sucharda. Kamil Roškot won the competition, but there was no competition for the building constructor. And again, like in Paris, Jaroslav Josef Polívka was hired without the competition because his construction design and supervising, managing the construction itself back in Paris was quite extraordinary, and they had great experiences with cooperation with Jaroslav Polívka. So they decided that Jaroslav Josef Polívka will come to New York and that he will overlook the construction itself. In 1938, in September 1938, to be precise, Jaroslav Josef Polívka came to the United States for the first time to overlook the construction. This was also already during a very difficult time politically back in Czechoslovakia, because Czechoslovakia was threatened by the German Republic, by Hitler, and they proclaimed the so-called Second Republic. And on March the 15th, 1939, Czechoslovakia was invaded by Hitler. So during the construction, these things happened over there in Czechoslovakia, and of course, Hitler and his administration didn't want the pavilion to be completed because Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. So there was no point, from their point of view, to present their own pavilion at the World Fair. And also, Germany withdrew from their attendance at the World Fair in 1939 as well. So Jaroslav Josef Polívka first came to the United States with SS Normandia. I found this beautiful picture. And he stayed for a couple of months, for about 6 months. He stayed at the Bedford Hotel on 118 East 40th Street in Lower Manhattan. And this is how they celebrated Christmas at the hotel in 1938 with his wife and with his son, who came a month afterwards. However, because of the obvious political reasons, Czechoslovak pavilion was in danger. They didn't know if they will be able to complete it because only the first shipment of the steel from Czechoslovakia arrived to the United States and Germany. After March 15, 1939, they stopped all the shipments of all the construction material to the United States. However, because it was not that important that it was made of Czechoslovak steel, Jaroslav Josef Polívka decided to contract Pennsylvania companies to ship their steel over here, and it was made half from Czechoslovak steel and half from Pennsylvania steel. Here we have a beautiful postcard of the finished pavilion. As you can see, the glass is not such an important element as in Paris 2 years before. This is from the back. The restaurant, the Czechoslovak restaurant, was here with beer and schnitzels and everything. However, there was a problem also with the shipment of the beer. They had to there was a very interesting correspondence because they had to buy off all the beer from the restaurants in New York State to be shipped to the pavilion. But anyways, that's another story and not that important. And here you can see it from the front. So they opened the pavilion on time because that was like the matter of pride and the matter of course, the resilience against Hitler and what was happening back in Czechoslovakia. However, Jaroslav Polívka left the United States at this time, and he decided to go back to Prague. On the way, they also took vacation in, I think, Madeira. But anyway, that's not that important either. They went back to Prague, but that was not such a good decision because Jaroslav Josef Polívka's wife, she was Jewish, and her whole entire family was Jewish. And of course, she didn't want to leave her family because they knew what was happening at that time. So Jaroslav Josef Polívka came back in probably June 1939 and opened the pavilion with the ambassador and others who participated in the organization of the pavilion, but his wife stayed back in Czechoslovakia. She was able to come to the United States in 1940, in September and October 1940. She had to pay a huge amount of money to actually be able to board one of the last trains that left Prague. She went to Berlin. From Berlin, she went to Moscow. She went all the way to Vladivostok. Then she went to Japan. And from Japan, she went to Honolulu. And from Honolulu, she came to San Francisco, which was like an astonishing thing to do for a single woman at that time. She was leaving her entire family behind, and she never saw them again. However, they opened the pavilion, so Jaroslav Josef Polívka was back in New York. His younger son Miloš, who was also a structural or aspiring structural engineer, he was also here in New York, and Maria Polívka, she made it in 1940, a year later. What was Jaroslav Polívka doing here? Jaroslav Josef Polívka actually got hired by Baťa Company in Maryland. Because of the whole presentation, because they presented shoes as the main goods to be exported from Czechoslovakia to the United States, Tomáš Baťa decided to build a huge campus in Maryland, and Jaroslav Josef Polívka was hired to design and again supervise some of the construction of the major factory buildings. Also, we have this proof. This is a portable department store for Tomáš Baťa that would move around the United States, and Tomáš Baťa will sell his shoes. Meanwhile, Jaroslav Josef Polívka wanted to, this is a lovely story which I love, which I just love to tell. Jaroslav Josef Polívka wanted to employ his son because of course he was here without any education in New York City. And he remembered that 2 years before, in 1937 World Fair in Paris, there was some American, some strange, extravagant American who became interested in this tiny statue. This was a tiny ceramic statue which was exhibited there, and this American guy wanted to get it. So Jaroslav Josef Polívka, because he was very kind and he tried to be very helpful throughout his entire life, he managed with the ceramic school that produced the statue to ship it to this strange American man. And this strange American man wasn't nobody, was a very important architect, as it turned out. His name was Richmond Sharif, who was one of the architects of the Empire State Building. And so he remembered that. He remembered this episode with this tiny ceramic statue, and he wrote to him that he has a son and he is looking for a job, and Richmond Sharif actually hired Miloš Polívka for his first building constructing job. We still don't know why Jaroslav Polívka decided to move to San Francisco, or what was, of course, because San Francisco is beautiful, but we don't know what was the main reason or what was the main idea behind it. Probably because at that time, at the same time when the World Fair in New York was happening, there was also a fair in San Francisco where also there was a Czechoslovak exhibition. You can see the pictures here. And probably Jaroslav Josef Polívka, to some extent, or some of his friends that were participating in the New York World Fair also worked at the World Fair in San Francisco, so they told him or they connected him with some people in San Francisco. But that's just a speculation. We still don't know what the main reason or what the main connection was and why particularly San Francisco. So Jaroslav Josef Polívka came to San Francisco, and he already knew Raymond D. Davis, who was a very significant person at UC Berkeley, and immediately he hired him as a researcher. So when Maria Polívka arrived to San Francisco, Jaroslav Polívka already had a job, and he was just about to get his first house. So let me skip a couple of years. During the Second World War, Jaroslav Polívka was not only a researcher at UC Berkeley, but he was also he also got himself hired to fight the Nazis and fight Hitler to Henry Kaiser, who had shipyards in Richmond, and he was assembling the ships. And Jaroslav Josef Polívka was helping him with some structural designs for the ship's assemblage. Right after the Second World War ended, Jaroslav Josef Polívka read an article in Architectural Records Architectural Journal. This article was about Frank Lloyd Wright and how he despises engineers. But that was specifically tied to the case of the falling water, because as you probably know, falling water keeps falling apart since it was finished. So Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't, of course, happy with this fact, and so he was trashing the engineers specifically of the falling water. However, he mentioned something that structural engineers do not have any imagination, and Jaroslav Polívka felt offended, and he wrote. In February 1946, he wrote a beautiful letter to Frank Lloyd Wright, and he was trying to argue that some engineers might have some imagination. And he mentioned that he actually loves watching the spider webs, because the spider webs are the ultimate construction, or the ultimate span construction, which was true. It was not just a move to astonished Frank Lloyd Wright. It was true because his grandchildren actually remembered that their grandmother, Jaroslav Polívka's wife, she wasn't supposed to get rid of any spider webs in the house. So he really admired spider webs, and he mentioned it in the letter. And Frank Lloyd Wright was probably very excited about meeting such a mind, and he immediately invited him to Taliesin West. Taliesin West was Frank Lloyd Wright's seat since 1930. I mean, his winter seat. He migrated between Wisconsin and Arizona, and he invited him to Arizona because they just moved there. And this is Jaroslav Polívka during one of his later visits at Taliesin West in front of one of the shelters that is no longer there. Jaroslav Josef Polívka visited Taliesin West at least 5 times over the next 12 years, and he probably visited Taliesin in Wisconsin once, but we are not sure about that. Jaroslav Josef Polívka was also an amateur photographer, and as you can see, he documented people he met at Taliesin West, and also he documented places and how the site developed over the years. This is the same place. You can see without the tower in 1946, with the tower constructed in 1949, and with the tower finished in 1957. Immediately during his first visit in 1946, they started to discuss 3 projects with Frank Lloyd Wright. And one of them was the Guggenheim Museum. The Guggenheim Museum was already in progress since 1943. However, Frank Lloyd Wright, especially at this point, was very frustrated with the project. Because in April 1946, right before, about 3 weeks before Jaroslav Polívka visited Taliesin West, he got some notes from the Guggenheims that they don't actually really like the project, and that also they returned the model of the Guggenheim Museum, and it got super damaged during the shipment. So Frank Lloyd Wright, you can imagine how Frank Lloyd Wright must have been frustrated at that point. However, Jaroslav Josef Polívka came up with some new bright ideas about the construction of the spiral ramp. So this right here, this is the spiral ramp before 1946, before Jaroslav Josef Polívka did his magic over there. Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't happy with the development of the project because, as you can see in the model, and there are other designs, other versions, where there had to be some inner support pillars always in all the projects. And Jaroslav Josef Polívka came up with the idea that actually they don't. So Jaroslav Josef Polívka actually applied the method of photoelasticity, which was quite a new method how to measure the pressure inside materials, inside the building construction materials. He already did some research in 1930s back in Czechoslovakia about photoelasticity. Then, when he came to UC Berkeley, he was hired to do research, specifically on photoelasticity, with Howard Eberhard, who was one of the leading scientists who did in mechanical engineering department, who was already building a laboratory that will be specialized in photoelasticity. And Jaroslav Josef Polívka came up with some calculations that we saw before that I can't explain to you actually because I'm an art historian, but you have to trust me and you have to trust other scholars that they make sense and that it was really revolutionary. And he came up with this model. This is a model that was constructed by Jaroslav Josef Polívka himself and his son Miloš, and that is supposed to prove that his design without the inner support actually works. These are actually schemes and calculations by a very distinguished scholar, Diego Martin Saiz, who wrote an astonishing dissertation on Jaroslav Josef Polívka's input to the Guggenheim Museum project. And so this is how they were trying to design it without Jaroslav Josef Polívka. How it was supposed to look like. This is the cylindrical spiral, and then Jaroslav Josef Polívka came up with the conical spiral, which, as you can see, has less stress than the cylindrical one. Again, I can't explain it to you. If you're interested, you can find it online. His dissertation is really astonishing. And here, you were probably wondering what this is. That was sort of a teaser for this talk, because nobody actually can see what it is. But this is actually the model that we're supposed to prove this construction and the calculations that Jaroslav Polívka did in his own office. This is actually one of the rarest photographs of his office, of the interior of his office, where all those black binders that I showed you actually are here on the shelves. And here you can see the final model, and you can see that they are without the inner support. And that's why we can enjoy, well, we can't because it's closed. The spiral is closed right now. If you will be inspired by this talk to go see it, please don't. It's closed right now. Hopefully it will open in a couple of weeks. But we can enjoy the spiral, this beautiful, beautiful space without any inner supports, and you can see that it would actually make a huge difference. Also, Jaroslav Josef Polívka, thanks to his Thermolux practice back in 1930s, redesigned the layout of the dome. Because again, it wasn't really working the way Frank Lloyd Wright and his fellows did it. There is another important actor in the whole story, who is Roger Corbetta. Roger Corbetta was the head of the Corbetta company, which was the main building company of the Guggenheim Museum. Jaroslav Josef Polívka and Roger Corbetta became friends. You can see him here, because we can't see Jaroslav Polívka here because he was taking the photographs, but you can see Roger Corbetta and Mrs. Polívka and Mrs. Corbetta at Taliesin West. So we were wondering why you probably never heard of Jaroslav Polívka and his huge impact on the Guggenheim project. He is mentioned very briefly in one of the notes in Neil Levine's book, but so it proves that Neil Levine knew about their correspondence and about their relationship, even though he decided not to mention this collaborative impact of Jaroslav Polívka. You can't even find it in the recent Guggenheim book where Joseph M. Siri actually mentions Eduardo Torroja's input, but there was no input, and I will tell you why in a second. Eduardo Torroja was a very distinguished Spanish architectural engineer and designer. He also had an architectural engineering institute, and Frank Lloyd Wright was very thrilled with him, but we don't know about any designs or any calculations that Eduardo Torroja would do for the Guggenheim project. And also, it's not mentioned in Francesco Dal Cos' monograph on the Guggenheim, because he actually decided to leave out 5 years of the development of the project in the book. However, now I will tell you why Joseph Siri thought that Eduardo Torroja might have been some help to Frank Lloyd Wright. Actually, we do have some letters from Frank Lloyd Wright to Eduardo Torroja when he's asking him for help on the Guggenheim project. However, that was only when he was not speaking to Jaroslav Polívka. In 1952, in March 15, 1952, there was a huge dispute between Frank Lloyd Wright and Jaroslav Polívka. The dispute was on many levels. I won't go into that because it's a very long, although very juicy story. It was mostly about money, who owns some money, but they stopped speaking for about 3 years. And during this time, this is the correspondence between Frank Lloyd Wright and Eduardo Torroja. During this time, Frank Lloyd Wright was asking Eduardo Torroja to help him. However, Eduardo Torroja had no intention to actually do something for the Guggenheim Museum project. However, there were some scholars, I already mentioned Diego Martin Saiz, who actually did a huge progress in acknowledging Jaroslav Polívka's role in the Guggenheim project and also other Frank Lloyd Wright's projects. First one was Barry Muscat, who did his master thesis at University at Buffalo, I think in 2000, on Jaroslav Polívka and his cooperation, 12-year lasting cooperation with Frank Lloyd Wright. And also there is a great chapter by Barry Bergdahl in the last Frank Lloyd Wright book that was published in 2016, where he explores the relationship and also the cooperation between Frank Lloyd Wright and Jaroslav Polívka on the Mile High building, although we do not really know if Jaroslav Polívka did any calculations for this project, but we know about 2 letters where they corresponded about it. Scholars usually thought that the ramp at V.C. Morris shop in San Francisco was actually some sort of a test for the Guggenheim ramp, for the Guggenheim spiral ramp. However, it was the other way around, because first Jaroslav Josef Polívka invented the calculations and invented the design for the Guggenheim ramp, and then he suggested it for the V.C. Morris shop, because we know again from their correspondence that Jaroslav Josef Polívka also worked on the V.C. Morris shop project, although we do not really know specifically what he did or what calculations he did, but we can assume that this was sort of an aftermath after he did some calculations for the Guggenheim project. So there were some bumps on the road during the cooperation between Frank Lloyd Wright and Jaroslav Josef Polívka, but in 1956, something about 1956, they made peace and they started working together again, and they started working on 4 or almost 5 different projects. And one of them was Belmont Racetrack Pavillion for the Belmont Park racetrack, which was actually quite a long-lasting racetrack in Belmont Park. You can see how it looked like in 1905. It was actually, again, the Guggenheims who wanted to be the investors for this project. So the Guggenheims hired Frank Lloyd Wright and his studio to come up with a new design. You can see that the design is very progressive. It is hanging between those two towers, and there was supposed to be a hanging, spanning steel construction, which was supposed to carry ferroconcrete, very thin ferroconcrete blocks. However, this was again an idea that Frank Lloyd Wright didn't come up with. And who came up with it? Of course, Jaroslav Josef Polívka. But he wasn't alone, and this is what's interesting about this project and other people who got involved in the project. We have to go back to 1940. In 1940, Jaroslav Josef Polívka made friends with Victor di Suvero. Victor di Suvero was a mechanical engineer from Italy who, during 1930s, came to China, because in China there were a lot of opportunities and many people from Europe came to China during 1930s. He came to China for a brief time. He was also in diplomatic services. But then when the Second World War started and Shanghai was occupied by Japan, he fled with his family to San Francisco. And somehow they met each other. We don't really know how. But immediately they started coming up with very crazy inventions. And I would also like to mention that at that time they wanted all these inventions to get patented, because that was a tool for architects to ensure their authorship and, of course, make money on their inventions. However, Jaroslav Josef Polívka, even though he came up with a lot of patents, for example, he also wanted to get patented an invention of an automatic anti-aircraft weapon during the Second World War, but it was never patented, and it didn't really get into production. But he came up with a lot of patents, but only one of them was accepted. One of them was really patented, and it was in 1957, and they didn't really make any money of it. Which was the same case with Frank Lloyd Wright. He also tried to get a lot of patents during his career, during his 60-year spanning career, but he only got a couple of patents and he never got rich of it. Unlike Richard Buckminster Fuller, who got rich of a lot of patents, of course. There is actually a really beautiful book coming up, or hopefully really beautiful book coming up on patents in architectural history by my colleague Peter Christensen from Rochester University. So he met Victor di Suvero. Not only that they came up with a lot of crazy inventions. For example, this is their invention how to prevent the Golden Gate Bridge from swinging in the wind, because at that time, they were really worried that it would actually happen, it would collapse because of the wind, like the Tahoma Bridge in Seattle Bay Area in 1940, I think 1 or 2. So they came up with this invention, and of course, it didn't really get into development for obvious aesthetical reasons. But they came up with another inventions. This is Victor di Suvero's drawing of Jaroslav Polívka holding a model of the Leaning Tower in Pisa, because in 1957, probably during some very festive dinner party, they came up with the idea that they can actually make it straight. So they wanted to get the way how they did it, we don't know, because we don't really have any calculations, but they really wanted to get the patent in Italy to straighten up the Leaning Tower in Pisa. And you can see that Jaroslav Polívka is very serious with the model. They also did a lot of political activities around this project. They contacted Bruno Zevi, Italian architect. They contacted Giorgio Neumann, who Jaroslav Polívka knew from his career in Switzerland. And they contacted Paolo Celasi. Paolo Celasi was another Italian immigrant to China in 1930s. Paolo Celasi was a structural engineer who came to China because of the huge structural development in China and the economical development in China in 1930s. However, he wasn't as lucky as Victor de Suvero because he didn't really escape Shanghai after it got occupied by Japan, and he actually got himself into Japanese concentration camp where he was for almost 2 years. And so he already contacted Jaroslav Polívka in 1941, but then with the occupation of Shanghai and his imprisonment in the concentration camp, they lost contact. But after he was released in 1945, he went straight to San Francisco and he found Jaroslav Polívka, and he asked him to help him. Actually, it's a very fascinating letter. It's like a 2-page letter where he's asking him for help to get him any job at UC Berkeley campus as a janitor or as a cleaning guy or whatever. Jaroslav Polívka, of course, had other ideas. He introduced him to Raymond D. Davis and to other distinguished scholars at UC Berkeley and Stanford University. However, Paolo Celasi had a post-traumatic stress disorder, and he wasn't really able to work afterwards and develop any of these projects. Together, right after he came to the United States with Jaroslav Polívka, they continued working on this idea of hangars or these hanging spanning constructions or spanning systems that were supposed to be designed for hangars. They also came up with an idea for a portable, movable hangar for the United States Army. However, at that time, in 1947, Jaroslav Polívka also met Eduardo Torroja through Raymond T. Davis, who met him in Paris, and he got fascinated by this Spanish engineer who was sort of kind of working for the fascist government in Spain. However, he came up with these beautiful construction designs, and this is the Hippodrome, the racetrack pavilion in Madrid. So Jaroslav Josef Polívka put all these designs together. The span construction for the Golden Gate Bridge he did with Victor de Suvero. The span constructions he did with Paolo Celasi, and these designs that were done by Eduardo Torroja, and he suggested the hanging spanning construction for the racetrack pavilion to Frank Lloyd Wright. At that time, Jaroslav Josef Polívka was already working for almost 10 years on publishing the Philosophy of Structures, which was an original book that was written by Eduardo Torroja, and it was translated into English by Jaroslav Polívka and also some other editors in San Francisco Bay Area. And at that same time, Eduardo Torroja was publishing another book. It was actually a translation of his previous Spanish book by the Dodge Publishing here in New York City. And that's another connection that connected Jaroslav Polívka, Eduardo Torroja, and Frank Lloyd Wright with New York City. Because Frank Lloyd Wright got involved with both of them books, although if you look at the books, you won't see it. Because Frank Lloyd Wright was supposed to write a foreword for both of the books, but Frank Lloyd Wright was already quite old and working on a lot of stuff and didn't really write any of those forewords. But he got involved in the publishing process of both of them. And Jaroslav Josef Polívka was actually in charge of selecting all the plates for the Philosophy of Structures book. And he was very clever because he took all these pictures from Eduardo Torroja that Eduardo Torroja wanted to be published in the book, and he put a couple of his own projects there, and also he put 2 of the joint projects with Frank Lloyd Wright there. So here you can see the racetrack pavilion in Belmont Park published on the page 148 of the Philosophy of Structures book. However, Eduardo Torroja was okay with that because it made the book more shiny and popular and decorated with Frank Lloyd Wright's name. Actually, after these 2 books were published and they were both endorsed by Frank Lloyd Wright, he asked Frank Lloyd Wright if he could put his portrait in the entrance hall of the Torroja Institute in Madrid. It was 1958. Frank Lloyd Wright passed away in April 1958, and Jaroslav Josef Polívka was already quite sick at that time. 1959, and Jaroslav Polívka was already quite sick at the time, so he actually wanted his two sons, who both became structural engineers. Miloš Polívka became a structural engineer at UC Berkeley, more like a researcher and theoretical structural engineer, and his son Jan, who lived on East Coast, he also became a structural engineer, and he was a contractor for many significant projects. And he wanted to make sure that both of his sons will continue working with Frank Lloyd Wright and his fellowship and the Taliesin studio. So he wrote this letter from February 28, 1957, where he's offering his two sons to Frank Lloyd Wright services, and he was actually hoping that Jan, since he was living East Coast, will actually become the building contractor for the Racetrack Pavillion at the Belmont Park. So Frank Lloyd Wright passed away in 1959, and Jaroslav Josef Polívka passed away not even a year afterwards. So the Belmont Racetrack Pavilion was never built. Actually, the Taliesin Fellowship, the Taliesin Associates, the fellows and employees of Frank Lloyd Wright continued working on it. They completely changed the project. William Wesley Peters was the main designer for the Racetrack Pavilion. They kept working on the project till early 1960s, but then they decided that they will not go forward with the project anyways. Nowadays, when I was researching for this talk, they are actually developing some exciting new projects for the Belmont Park and the Belmont Racetrack. And that's it. So we went through all these three projects that were concerned with Jaroslav Polívka, and hopefully all this babbling will be more organized in the book. So hopefully in February 2024 there will be a book, Philosopher of Structures, architect and engineer Jaroslav J. Polívka. Hopefully the year afterwards, in 2025, it will be published also in English. So hopefully I can come back and present the English book. So thank you so much for coming. Hope it wasn't too long. Yeah, it was, sorry. And hopefully you learned a fascinating story.
Thank you so much for a wonderful bit of storytelling. I think probably everyone in the room learned at least one thing that they did not know about the content that you covered today. So if you're game, I'd like to open it up for questions from our audience. One right here.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really just a whole lot that I didn't know, and what an inspiring character. You mentioned that he had an appreciation for spider webs and redesigned the Oculus at the Guggenheim. Is there any evidence that he was inspired by spider webs for the Oculus redesign?
No, not really. He was actually, for the Oculus, he wasn't really, there was no like specific inspiration for any specific project, but he was just admiring them, probably sitting on his terrace. There's a lovely view to see the entire Bay Area, so he's probably sitting on his terrace and just admiring spiders making their spider webs. But there was like no connection to any specific project. But there was actually one project that was done by the Thermolux company, I think it was in Germany, with a dome that was similar to this. And that was actually an inspiration for the Oculus at the Guggenheim Museum.
I'm curious about the letters and the way you designed the title of the book.
Right, yeah, I didn't really, because it's kind of a new design, and I didn't really have time to discuss it with the designer, so I can't really help you with that, but I'll ask him, or you can write him. He's an emerging, very promising graphic designer, and I'm sure there is some reason behind it, but sorry, I don't know it yet.
Just curious whether Jan Pokorny knew Jaroslav. Whether there was an overlap. Do you know Jan Pokorny, who was involved in the restoration
right.
of the facade here and all the architectural happenings? But was there any crossover?
No, I don't know. I don't know about that. Sorry, no.
I imagine it's a complicated story, but I wonder if you could say in general terms why you think the previous narratives about the Guggenheim Museum either completely ignored or underplayed. Was it a lack of knowledge, or was there some other angle that these scholars wanted to foreground?
Right. That's a very complicated question because, of course, there's this huge myth of Frank Lloyd Wright, how he was the genius who created everything by himself, and the people he worked with were only the technical help who really didn't come up with any creative inputs. So that's one thing, and let me say that it was still very strong among his apprentices, most of them, until recently, because they are in the 80s and 90s. So that was, of course, one reason. However, there was another reason, and of course we can't really blame the scholars because there were these 14 boxes in Ron Polívka's attic, and nobody saw them in 30, 40 years. So even though Ron Polívka is a structural engineer and he actually built multiple skyscrapers in San Francisco, but he retired recently, and that was the reason why he pulled out these boxes and he started looking at them with me, and we learned a lot and we had a lot of fun while doing that. But a lot of material, a lot of the archival information were actually missing, because there was one archive at University at Buffalo, but that was donated by Jaroslav Polívka's children in 1980s, and they only selected very carefully and very specifically things that were related to Frank Lloyd Wright, and that were more like about Frank Lloyd Wright than they were about Jaroslav Polívka. So, yeah, there was this lack of knowledge as well. However, some scholars like Barry Muscat, who was really one of the leading scholars who actually came up with this research and with this idea, and Jack Quinan, who was his supervisor, he did an amazing job with the archival material that was available to him, and they also did an exhibition at University at Buffalo, and they also did a small publication. So that was really the beginning of the research of Jaroslav Polívka here in the United States. Yeah.
Means that the photos of the models, they were in the boxes or in that, let's say, what you show at the beginning, by the family, that was your discovery of this kind of photographs?
No, the pictures of the models were actually already part of the collection at the University at Buffalo, but there is a collection of something about 550 negatives, and not all scholars are willing to go through 550 negatives, because there were no positives. There are glass negatives to find two pictures of a model of the Guggenheim Museum. So yeah.
I have a question that's not related to architecture, really. Since he was Czech,
yes.
How much did he keep in touch with other Czechs while he was in America, and did he know Anthony Raymond?
Yes. Well, I don't think they knew each other personally. No, they did. They did know each other, but of course they lost touch after Antonín Raymond migrated first to the United States and then to Japan. And then we don't know about any connections between other Frank Lloyd Wright's apprentices, because I also was wondering if there were some connections between Antonín Raymond, Vladimír Karfík, and Jaroslav Polívka about Frank Lloyd Wright. There was a connection between Jaroslav Polívka and Vladimír Karfík during 1930s, because Jaroslav Polívka also briefly worked for Tomáš Baťa back in Czechoslovakia, in Zlín. But we don't know if they discussed Frank Lloyd Wright or not, and his experience with Frank Lloyd Wright from 1929. And he knew Antonín Raymond from way back before the First World War, when they were both students. But they were not classmates, because Antonín Raymond studied Czech Technical University and Jaroslav Polívka studied German Technical University, which were totally different schools, totally different universities. So, yeah, but Jaroslav Polívka actually never visited Czechoslovakia after he immigrated to the United States. After the Second World War, because they left the apartment and there was the library and there were some of the artworks, he decided what to do with it. He got some of the stuff shipped to the United States. Most of the papers and most of the library actually was donated to the National Technical Museum, and that's how the collection there of Jaroslav Polívka started. and he only stayed in touch. He stayed in touch with some of the expats. We know that he was in touch with Ladislav Sutnar. He was in touch with the Kubelík family and some others. And the only person that we know of that he stayed in touch with from Czechoslovakia and from the architecture field was Antonín Engel. But he was not in touch with Karel Honzík, Josef Havlíček, none of these people who he was associated with in 1920s.
I was wondering, I've heard at least 2 different conference papers on the Czechoslovak Pavilion at the World's Fair in New York, because it's such a wonderful story. It's just a fantastic story of Czech patriotism in difficult times. Do you know if the scholarship there, the existing scholarship there, had acknowledged Polívka's role?
Last year in Paris, there was a huge conference organized by the Brno Masaryk University and the Institute of Art History at Sorbonne that was specifically dedicated to world fairs and the representation and the politics behind it and so on and so forth. And I presented this piece about, oops, did I do something? No? I don't know. Anyways, I presented a paper there about Jaroslav Polívka and the recently found archival documents that actually document his role and his key role in finishing it and putting it together and doing all that, because Jaroslav Polívka also, there was a slight shift between the Paris Pavilion and the New York Pavilion in the whole organization. Because the Paris Pavilion was organized by Jan Sucharda and other officers from the ministry themselves, and it was paid to the contractors by the ministry itself. However, Jaroslav Polívka and his company was actually contracted by the ministry to be the main contractor, and he paid all the other subcontractors. So he was really the main person, and he was really the main figure and actor who really literally put it together and who is responsible for finishing it.
Great, thank you.
Does he have the opportunity to participate of the design of other pavilion?
No, he only participated in these 2, in 1937 and 1939 in New York. It's mostly because up until 1936, he was really the employee of the employer of the Thermolux company, and he really didn't have any of his own company that could actually participate in any of these public commissions. So he only had opportunity to participate in these 2. Even though Czechoslovakia did participate in 1935 World Fair in Brussels.
I'd like to give a big hand for our speaker. Thanks so much for coming to New York.
Thank you.
And thank you, our audience, for coming tonight on a not completely lovely night. And do please follow us in our program. Come again for our next events. Thank you.
Thank you so much.